There's something hauntingly beautiful about a love story that defies the very laws of the world, where two souls, never meant to meet, find each other against all odds. Tonight, we step into the twilight realm of Doriath, where the air hums with magic and the trees whisper ancient secrets. Can you hear it? The soft rustle of leaves, the distant melody of a voice so pure it could melt the stars. That's Lúthien Tinuviel, the fairest of all elven maidens, dancing beneath the silver boughs of her father's kingdom. Her song is more than music. It's a spell, a call that echoes through the shadows, reaching even the most broken of hearts. And one heart in particular is listening. Beren, a mortal man, scarred by loss and driven by grief, stumbles into her world, and in that single moment, everything changes. Their eyes meet, and the threads of fate tighten around them, binding their destinies in ways neither could foresee. But love like this doesn't come without a price. The Dark Lord Morgoth looms over Middle-earth, his malice stretching like a suffocating shadow, and the Silmarils, those cursed jewels of light, hold the key to their future. Beren's vow to reclaim one from Morgoth's crown isn't just a quest, it's a rebellion against the very order of the world. Where are you joining us from tonight? Is it late where you are, with the moon high and the world quiet, or perhaps early morning, with dawn just brushing the horizon? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear how your own journey into this tale begins. Because this isn't just a story, it's an invitation to step into a realm where love is both a weapon and a weakness, where every choice carries the weight of eternity. Lúthien, with her otherworldly grace, and Beren, with his mortal fire, are about to embark on a path that will test everything they are. And you, dear listener, are right there with them, feeling the chill of Morgoth's gaze, the ache of impossible longing, the thrill of a love so fierce it could outshine even the Silmarils themselves. So close your eyes for a moment. Picture the glade where Lúthien dances, her dark hair shimmering like spilled ink under the starlight. Feel the tension in the air as Beren steps forward, his heart pounding with a hope he thought long dead. This is where the epic begins, not with a battle cry, but with a glance, a breath, a promise whispered into the night. The road ahead is paved with treachery and terror, but also with a love so bright it could defy even the darkest of fates. And tonight, we follow them into the unknown, one step at a time. Are you ready? Beren stood before King Thingol, with the weight of two worlds pressing on his shoulders. The shimmering halls of Doriath around him, the shadow of Morgoth's fortress looming beyond. The air was thick with silence as Thingol's gaze, cold as winter stone, measured this mortal who dared love his daughter. When the king spoke, his words were not a test, but a sentence. Bring me a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown, and you may claim Lúthien's hand. A gasp rippled through the court. Even the elves knew this was no quest. It was a death warrant, a cruel jest wrapped in the guise of honor. But Beren, his voice steady as the roots of the earth, accepted without hesitation. In that moment, he carved his fate into the bones of history. And what of Lúthien? She who had danced freely under the stars now felt the chains of her father's decree tighten around her heart. For the first time, the Princess of Doriath understood the bitter taste of powerlessness. Her love, once a secret joy, had become a weapon turned against them both. Yet as Beren turned to leave, his footsteps heavy with resolve, something kindled within her. Not despair, but fire. If the world would bend them to its will, she would learn to bend it back. Think of the courage it takes to walk knowingly into darkness. Beren, armed with nothing but a mortal's fragile hope, set his face toward Angband, where nightmares took solid form. Every step away from Doriath was a step deeper into legend, but also into sorrow. He left not because he feared Thingol's wrath, but because he refused to let Lúthien share his doom. Yet love is never so easily contained. Behind him, unheard by all but the wind, Lúthien's resolve hardened like steel, quenched in starlight. She would not wait like some weeping maiden in a tower. Her story, too, demanded to be written not in ink, but in defiance. The road ahead was impossible, but that was the nature of oaths sworn in the face of gods and kings. Beren's pledge was more than a promise. It was a rebellion against the very order of the world, a challenge hurled at the feet of fate itself. And though he walked alone, he was never truly solitary, for Lúthien's spirit, fierce and unbroken, had already begun to weave its own path through the shadows toward him. Lúthien's heart beat in time with the distant drums of rebellion, each pulse a silent vow to shatter the gilded cage of Doriath. The halls that had once echoed with her laughter now felt like prison walls, their beauty twisted by her father's decree. But she was no ordinary princess. Her blood carried the magic of the Maor, and her will burned brighter than the stars. When the guard's vigilance wavered, she moved like mist through the corridors, her voice weaving a spell of sleep over those who would bar her way. The very air seemed to bend to her command, shadows stretching to hide her flight, leaves rustling to mask her footsteps. This was no desperate escape. It was a transformation. The moment Lúthien ceased to be a jewel in her father's crown and became instead a storm gathering its strength. Beyond the gates, the forest welcomed her with open arms. Ancient oaks leaned their branches low, offering passage over tangled roots, while silver streams diverted their courses to guide her. Even the creatures of the wood fell silent, their eyes gleaming with knowing as she passed, a daughter of twilight stepping into her power. Every step carried her further from safety, closer to the darkness where Beren had vanished. She could feel the thread between them, taut and humming, as if fate itself had plucked it like a harp string. Yet defiance came at a cost. The further she strayed from Doriath's protection, the heavier the world's weight pressed upon her. Elven lore whispered that no maiden of her line had ever dared such a path, and the whispers coiled around her like a chill wind. But Lúthien's resolve was forged in something deeper than tradition. It was forged in love, raw and unyielding. She would face werewolves, sorcery, even the void itself, if it meant standing at Beren's side, and so the forest bore witness as she danced across its hidden paths, her cloak of shadows flaring behind her like wings. Behind her, the echoes of pursuit faded. Ahead, the road twisted into realms where even the bravest elves feared to tread, but Lúthien did not falter. For the first time in her immortal life, she was truly free, not because she had escaped her father's halls, but because she had chosen her own perilous road. And somewhere in the gathering dark, a mortal man walked toward doom, unaware that the stars themselves had begun to shift in their courses, all for the sake of a love that would not be contained. The forest held its breath as Lúthien emerged from the silver-lit shadows, her footsteps silent on the moss-covered earth. There, slumped against the gnarled roots of an ancient oak, Beren sat with his sword across his knees, his face gaunt from hunger, his cloak torn by thorns and teeth. Yet his eyes still burned with that stubborn fire she'd loved from the first moment. When he looked up and saw her, the shock that crossed his face twisted into something sharper, dread. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice raw from nights spent whispering to the dark. But Lúthien only knelt beside him, her hands brushing the dirt from his brow with a touch lighter than spider silk. "Neither should you," she murmured, "and yet here we both are." The air between them crackled with all the words they couldn't speak. Beren's fingers trembled as they closed around hers, not from weakness, but from the terror of what her presence meant. Every danger he'd faced, every wound he'd borne, had been to spare her this very path. Thingol's decree was my burden, not yours, he insisted, his jaw tight. Angband is no place for an elf, Lúthien interrupted, her voice soft but edged like a blade. Or for a woman, her gaze never wavered, though her pulse raced beneath her skin. For the first time, she saw the fear behind his courage, not fear of death, but of failing her, and that was the heart of it, wasn't it? Beren, who had faced wolves and shadows without flinching, feared his own mortal frailty more than Morgoth's wrath. What if his strength wasn't enough? What if his love doomed her? Lúthien sensed the unspoken questions like bruises beneath his skin. She cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You think I don't know the risk," she whispered. "I crossed leagues of wilderness, wove spells to fell my own kin's guards, not because I'm reckless, but because I choose you. Not as my protector, but as my equal." Something fractured in Beren, then not his resolve, but the lonely weight of it. His breath came ragged as he pressed his forehead to hers, their shared warmth a defiance against the gathering dark. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with wonder. "All my life, I've been a man of fleeting seasons. You are the eternal starlight." Lúthien smiled, though her tears gleamed like dewdrops. "Then let me be your light in the dark," she said. "Not behind you, not ahead of you, with you." The wind shifted, carrying the distant howl of hunting beasts. But as they rose together, their fingers interlaced, the sound held no power over them. Beren adjusted his sword belt, his other hand never leaving hers. Lúthien's cloak billowed like a banner as she turned her face toward the north, where the mountains loomed like broken teeth. No more arguments, no more parting. Whatever lay ahead, wolves, sorcery, the very gates of Angband, they would meet it as one. Two hearts, two wills, woven into a single unbreakable thread. And so they stepped forward, not toward doom, but toward destiny. The road north was a tapestry of whispers wind through bare branches, the distant cry of hunting birds, the crunch of frost underfoot. Beren and Lúthien moved like shadows, their breaths mingling in the cold air, each step carrying them deeper into lands where even the sunlight seemed hesitant to linger. But the greatest dangers often wear familiar faces. When the horn sounded, sharp and sudden against the silence, it wasn't orcs or wolves that emerged from the trees. It was elves, proud and terrible, their armor gleaming like frozen starlight. Celegorm and Curufin, sons of Fëanor, rode at the head of their company, their smiles as sharp as the swords at their hips. At first, their words were honeyed. "What fortune," Celegorm called, his voice smooth as polished steel, "to find the fairest jewel of Doriath so far from her father's halls." His gaze flickered to Beren, lingering on the mortal's worn cloak and scarred hands. and something darker stirred beneath his courtesy. The brothers dismounted, their movements too deliberate, their eyes alight with a hunger that had nothing to do with kinship. They spoke of alliances, of shared purpose, but their promises were nets woven from half-truths. Every offer to escort Lúthien to safety, every sly suggestion that Beren continue his quest alone, dripped with venom. Lúthien's fingers tightened around Beren's wrist, her nails biting into his skin, a silent warning. She knew the stories of Fëanor's oath, the fire that had consumed his sons, twisting their pride into something monstrous. These were not rescuers, they were hunters who'd stumbled upon precious prey. When Curufin reached for her bridle, his voice dripping with false concern, Beren stepped between them, his sword half drawn, the air shattered. What followed was a blur of steel and snarls. Celegorm's men closed in, their loyalty bought with whispers of glory and Silmarils. Beren fought like a man possessed, his blade a flash of desperation, but the odds were cruel. For every foe he felled, two more took their place. It was Lúthien who turned the tide. Her voice rose, not in song but in command, a single word of power that cracked the earth beneath their attackers' feet. Vines erupted from the soil, coiling around limbs, yanking horses to their knees. The brothers reeled, their faces twisted with fury, and something else. Fear. They hadn't expected the princess to be a storm in elven form. As the chaos stilled, Celegorm spat into the dirt, his once fine cloak tangled in thorns. "You'll regret this," he hissed, but the threat rang hollow. The moment had laid bare the rot beneath their glittering facades. Beren, bleeding but unbowed, hauled himself upright, his gaze locked on Lúthien. No words passed between them, only the understanding that trust was now a luxury they couldn't afford. Even among their own kind, betrayal wore a crown. The brothers fled, but their shadows lingered, clinging to the trees like smoke. Lúthien knelt beside Beren, her hands trembling as she pressed them to his wounds. The magic that flowed from her fingertips was warm, golden, but her eyes were winter. "They'll come again," she whispered. Beren caught her hand, pressing his lips to her palm. "Let them," he murmured against her skin. The road ahead was darker now, but they'd learned its first cruel lesson. In a world where oaths were shackles and love was rebellion, even light could cut like a knife. The air grew thick with the stench of decay as Beren and Lúthien approached Tol-in-Gaurhoth, the accursed isle where shadows clung like living things. The bridge to Sauron's stronghold loomed ahead, a jagged arch of black stone slick with unseen horrors. Beneath it, the river hissed and churned, its waters whispering of drowned souls. Lúthien's fingers tightened around Beren's arm, not in fear, but in warning. This place was alive with malice, its very stones drinking in despair. Yet her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "He knows we're here," she murmured. Above them, the tower's spires clawed at the sky, their peaks lost in a swirling fugue of smoke and screams. Sauron did not greet them with armies or fire. He came in silence, a presence so vast it pressed against their lungs like a hand, squeezing the breath from them. His voice, when it finally slithered into their minds, was layered with mockery. A mortal and a songbird, it cooed. "What delicious folly brings you to my doorstep?" Beren's sword trembled in his grip, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of the darkness pressing down. Yet Lúthien stepped forward, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing. She did not answer him with steel, but with song. Her melody began softly, a ripple of silver in the gloom, but with each note it swelled, a tempest of light and defiance. The very air shuddered as her voice tangled with Sauron's will, a duel woven from sound and shadow. Stones cracked underfoot, their fractures glowing with an eerie radiance. The werewolves lurking in the pits howled, their cries turning to whimpers as the light seared their eyes. Sauron's form flickered, his smug certainty unraveling thread by thread. He had expected a maiden's plea, not the fury of a star unleashed. Beren, though battered and bleeding from the climb, planted himself at Luthien's side. His presence was an anchor, his mortal stubbornness a counterpoint to her ethereal power. When Sauron lashed out, his tendrils of darkness recoiled, not from strength of arms, but from the sheer audacity of their unity. Here was love, raw and untamed, refusing to kneel. The tower groaned as its master's grip faltered. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, Sauron's form shattered like glass, his essence fleeing into the night. The isle fell silent, save for the ragged gasps of the victorious, but triumph tasted bitter. As the dust settled, Lúthien swayed, her strength spent. Beren caught her, his hands trembling not from fear now, but from the dawning realization this was only the beginning. Beyond Tol-in-Gaurhoth, the iron mountains loomed, their peaks lost in storm clouds. Angband waited there, its gates forged from despair, its halls echoing with the footsteps of Morgoth himself. The Silmaril glittered in his crown, a beacon of impossible hope. And yet, as Beren lifted Lúthien into his arms, her breath warm against his neck, he knew retreat was never an option. They had faced a Maya, and won not with armies, but with the unbreakable threads of trust and defiance. The road ahead would demand more than courage. It would demand everything. But for now, in the hush of the ruined isle, they allowed themselves a single, stolen moment, a breath before the storm. The ground trembled beneath their feet as Beren and Lúthien stood before the gates of Angband, their outlines swallowed by the towering black iron arches that stretched into the smothering dark. The air tasted of ash and something older, fear thick enough to choke on. Every breath felt like drawing in the weight of centuries of torment. Lúthien's fingers, cold and delicate in Beren's callous grip, squeezed once, a silent reminder, we are still here. We are still together. She lifted her free hand, and the shadows themselves seemed to lean in, eager to obey. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 lullabies. The melody curled around the slumped forms of Morgoth's guards, hulking shapes with eyes like dying embers. One by one, their weapons slipped from grasp, their monstrous heads drooping as if the very night had reached inside their skulls and gentled the fire there. The spell was fragile, a thread of starlight strung across a chasm, but it held. Beren exhaled slowly, his dagger a pitiful sliver of metal against the might of Angband. He knew the numbers, knew that beyond these gates lay legions of nightmares, corridors carved from suffering, and at the end of it all, the Dark Lord himself, enthroned in malice. This wasn't a battle, it was a suicide, and yet, as Lúthien's song faded into the silence, her eyes met his, and he saw no hesitation there, only resolve, bright and terrible as a naked blade. They moved as one, slipping between the sleeping sentinels, their footsteps soundless on the scorched earth. The gates loomed, their hinges groaning like the voices of the damned. Beyond them, the darkness pulsed, alive and hungry. Beren's pulse hammered in his throat, but his grip on Lúthien never wavered. If this was madness, then let it be glorious. If this was folly, let it echo through the ages. The moment they crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped, the cold seeping into their bones like a poison. The walls seemed to breathe around them, their surfaces slick with something that glistened in the faint, sickly glow of distant torches. Every shadow writhed with unseen things, whispers skittering just beyond comprehension. Lúthien's cloak of woven twilight tightened around her shoulders, as if trying to shield her from the gaze of the fortress itself. Somewhere deep in the labyrinth of stone and suffering, Morgoth stirred. The weight of his attention pressed down like a physical thing, a predator sensing the brush of prey against its domain. But Beren and Lúthien did not stop. They couldn't, not now, not when every step carried them closer to the heart of their doom and their destiny. The Silmaril awaited, its light trapped in a crown of twisted metal and older hatreds. And though the air reeked of despair, though the walls whispered of futility, they walked on, because love, real love, isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to move forward anyway, hand in hand into the teeth of the dark. The air in Angband's throne room was thick with the scent of charred flesh and old blood, a miasma that clung to the back of Beren's throat as he crept forward. Morgoth slumbered upon his black throne, his massive form wreathed in shadows that pulsed like a living thing. But the Silmaril, the Silmaril, it blazed atop his iron crown, its light so pure it carved through the gloom like a knife through silk. Every instinct screamed at Beren to turn back, to flee from that unbearable radiance, but Lúthien's presence at his side was a silent anchor. Her fingers brushed his wrist once, a fleeting touch that said everything, now. Beren moved, his dagger, forged by elven hands and blessed with whispered spells, flashed toward the crown. The moment the steel touched the Silmaril's setting, a sound like shattering glass split the air. The blade snapped, its fragments scattering like fallen stars. The jewel seared his palm as he wrenched it free, the pain so vast it swallowed thought. His flesh smoked, the stench of burning skin mingling with the metallic tang of blood, but he did not let go. Could not. The Silmaril's light pulsed in his grip, a heartbeat not his own, searing his bones white hot. Above them, Morgoth stirred. The throne groaned as the Dark Lord shifted, his cyclopean eye rolling beneath its lid. The very air trembled with the threat of his waking. Terror, cold and slick, coiled in Beren's gut, but before it could take root, Lúthien's voice rose, a song woven not of beauty now, but of raw, desperate power. Her melody wrapped around them like a cloak, twisting the shadows into a veil that shimmered between truth and dream. Morgoth's breath rattled, his consciousness lapsing back into slumber, but the reprieve was fragile. They had seconds, not minutes. They fled, their footsteps soundless on the cursed stone. The Silmaril burned against Beren's chest, its light leaking through his fingers like liquid fire. Behind them, the hall echoed with the first growls of awakening horrors. Then came the howl, a sound so deep it vibrated in the teeth. Karcharoth, the Red Maw, Morgoth's mightiest wolf, barred their path at the threshold, his jaws dripping with venom, his eyes twin pits of malice. Beren shoved Lúthien behind him, his remaining hand, gripping the hilt of a broken sword. What happened next was a blur of fangs and fury. Karcharoth lunged, his maw closing around Beren's wrist with a crunch of bone. Pain exploded, white and absolute, as the wolf tore his hand clean off the hand that still clutched the Silmaril. The jewel tumbled into the beast's gullet, and its light flared once, horribly, before being swallowed by the dark. Karcharoth recoiled, howling, the holy fire searing him from within. The distraction was all they needed. Lúthien dragged Beren forward, her strength inhuman, as she half-carried him through the gates. Blood slicked the stones behind them, each drop a testament to the price of their defiance. Beren's vision swam, his body shuddering with shock, but through the haze, one thought burned clear: they had done it. They had stolen light from the heart of darkness, and though the cost was written in blood and missing flesh, though the Silmaril now festered in the belly of a monster, the deed itself was a spark that would outlast them. Somewhere in the void behind, Morgoth's roar shook the foundations of Angband, a sound of wrath so vast it sent cracks racing up the fortress walls. But Beren and Lúthien were already beyond the gates, stumbling into the night, their breaths ragged, their hearts pounding in sync. The stars above blazed with a fierceness they had never noticed before, as if the heavens themselves were bearing witness. This was not an ending. It was the beginning of a legend, one written in scars and starlight, in a love that had dared to steal fire from the gods. Blood painted the forest path as Beren and Lúthien staggered toward Doriath's borders, their breaths ragged as wounded animals. The once proud warrior leaned heavily against her, his remaining hand clutching the stump of his wrist where Karcharoth's teeth had sheared through flesh and bone. Every step sent fresh waves of agony through him, but it wasn't the pain that hollowed his chest. It was the silence where the Silmaril's pulse had been, that stolen light now burning in the belly of a monster. Lúthien's arm around his waist never wavered, though her own strength was spent, her magic drained to embers. Yet her voice, when she whispered to him, was steady as the roots of the earth. Almost there, she lied, because hope was the only medicine she had left. The gates of Mennygroth loomed before them, their carvings of birds and blossoms suddenly grotesque in their serenity. When the guards saw them, the mortal reduced to a bloodied shadow, the princess cloaked in tattered twilight, their cries brought the entire court running. King Thingol emerged like a storm given form, his fury already coiling around the words he'd prepared. But then he saw the missing hand, the way Beren's body sagged against his daughter's. Saw the hollow triumph in their eyes, his lips parted, and for the first time in his immortal reign, the Elven king found himself mute. Lúthien didn't wait for his judgment. She sank to the moss-strewn floor, with Beren cradled against her, her fingers pressing into the gaps of his ruined tunic, as if she could stitch his soul back into his flesh. He needs healing, she demanded, though her voice cracked like thin ice. The court healers surged forward, their hands fluttering over Beren's wounds, but their faces told the truth before their tongues could shape it. The venom of Angband ran too deep, its tendrils woven through muscle and marrow. A mortal body wasn't meant to survive such ravaging. Thingol's voice, when it finally came, was softer than anyone had ever heard it. You truly went into the black pit, he murmured, not as accusation, but as awe. You faced Morgoth in his lair. Beren managed a weak smile, his cracked lips parting. And I brought back proof. With his last strength, He lifted his maimed arm, the absence of his hand more eloquent than any jewel. A gasp rippled through the gathered elves. Here was a vow fulfilled in blood and bone, a sacrifice that dwarfed even their ancient grudges. But Lúthien wasn't listening. Her fingers traced the clammy skin of Beren's temples as his breathing grew shallow, each rise of his chest more labored than the last. The healer's potions could ease the pain, but not the inevitable, not the slow, creeping cold that had already begun to claim him. Something inside her fractured then, not in breaking, but in bending toward a terrible resolve. She had danced through nightmares and sung down a Maya, but this enemy, this quiet thief called mortality, she would not accept. As dusk painted the halls in shades of violet and gold, she pressed her forehead to Beren's and whispered words not meant for living ears. Then she rose, her stained gown swirling around her like a shroud, and turned toward the western gardens, where the nightingale's song still lingered. The path she chose now would make Angband seem a mere shadow, for beyond the circles of the world, in halls where even elves dared not tread, sat Mandos the Doomsman, keeper of the dead, weigher of fates. And to him, with nothing left but the raw, bleeding edges of her love, Lúthien Tinuviel would plead, not for a Silmaril, not for glory, but for the one thing no elf had ever asked of the valor, a mortal's life, reclaimed from the void. The stars themselves seemed to hold their breath as she knelt alone in the garden, her song rising not in power this time, but in supplication, a melody woven from memory and longing, from the first touch of Beren's callous fingers against hers, from the way his laughter had warmed her more than any summer sun. The very air trembled with the weight of her plea, the grass withering beneath her knees, as if the earth itself recoiled from such audacity. But Lúthien did not falter. If the doomsman's heart could be moved, it would be by this, not by strength, but by the unbearable tenderness of a love that refused to let go. The halls of Mandos were not made for the living. The air hung thick with the whispers of the departed, 1,000 sighs woven into the cold stone. Lúthien stepped forward, her bare feet silent against the marble floor, the hem of her gown whispering against the dust of forgotten ages. Before her loomed the doomsman himself, his face hidden in shadow, his presence vast and unyielding as the roots of the world. She did not kneel, she did not bow. Instead, she lifted her chin, her voice rising not in defiance, but in a lament so raw it seemed to crack the very air between them. The song began softly, a thread of sound spun from memory, Beren's laughter in the glades of Doriath, the warmth of his hand in hers, the way his eyes had held the light of the Silmaril, even as his blood soaked the earth. But as the melody swelled, it became something more, an offering, a plea, a rebellion against the order of the universe itself. To the valor, death was the gift of men, a mystery not meant to be undone. Yet here stood Lúthien, her voice trembling with the weight of her love, offering the only thing she had left, her immortality. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. Mandos, who had never once bent his knee to pity, turned his face away. Some say it was to hide the first tear ever shed in those hallowed halls. When he spoke at last, his voice was not the thunder of judgment, but the slow creak of a door long shut. You would trade eternity for a heartbeat, he asked, not in scorn, but in wonder. Lúthien's answer was the barest whisper, yet it echoed like a shout. I would trade all the ages of the world for one more dawn with him. The doomsman's sigh stirred the dust at his feet. So be it. The words were not a blessing, nor a curse, but a ripple in the tapestry of fate. He could not grant her wish, as she had asked. No power in Arda could sever the threads of mortality once woven. But he could weave anew. "You shall both return," he murmured, "not as elf and man, but as mortals bound to the same doom. Your days will be as fleeting as his, your joy as fragile, your end as certain." Lúthien did not flinch. She had walked through fire and faced the gaze of Morgoth. What was death compared to a life without Beren? Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, not in fear, but in fierce, trembling gratitude. The valor had never before been moved by the sorrow of the children of Iluvatar. Yet here, in this moment, love had done what no army, no oath, no Silmaril could achieve. It had bent the will of the unseen powers. As the decree settled around her like a cloak, the air shimmered, the halls of Mandos dissolving into mist. Somewhere beyond the veil, Beren's spirit stirred, drawn back toward the light by the unbreakable thread of her song. They would awaken together, not in the undying lands, not in the wreckage of Angband, but in the forests of Osiriand, where the river murmurs would lull them into their second life. And though their time would be brief, though their bones would one day return to the earth, their love would outlast even the stars. For in the end, it was not the length of days that shaped the legends of Arda, but the brightness with which they were burned. Osiriand's emerald glades wrapped around them like a sigh. The river sung a lullaby after the screams of Angband. Here, in this hidden corner of the world, time moved differently, not in the slow, measured strides of elven immortality, nor the frantic rush of mortal years, but in the quiet, golden spaces between. Beren's missing hand no longer ached, though the scar remained, a pale knot of flesh beneath Lúthien's fingertips, when she traced it in the dawn light. His laughter, once ragged with pain, now rolled free and easy, mingling with the chatter of the stream. They built no halls, raised no towers. Their home was the dappled shade of willow boughs, their roof the ever-changing sky. Yet peace, they knew, was not the absence of shadows, but the choice to kindle light in spite of them. Some nights, when the wind carried echoes of distant battles, the clash of Fëanor's sons, the weeping of ruined kingdoms, Beren would tense, his body remembering the weight of a sword. Lúthien, her head against his shoulder, would hum fragments of the song that had swayed even Mandos, until the tension bled from his bones. They spoke little of the Silmaril, though its absence lingered between them like a ghost. What was stolen light compared to the warmth of shared breath? The way Beren's voice softened when he called her Tinuviel, nightingale, as if the word itself was a secret. The world beyond their glade spiraled deeper into darkness. Tales reached them, whispered by wandering elves or carried on the wings of birds, of Doriath's borders tightening like a fist, of Morgoth's armies seething in the north. But in Osiriand, spring bloomed reckless and bright, painting the forest in hues even Lúthien's loom could not capture. She wove instead with words, spinning their story into ballads that made Beren's eyes glint with unshed tears. "Sing it true," he'd murmur, not as a tragedy, but as a torch. And so she did, her voice threading their joys and sorrows into something that would outlast them both. Their second life was not the forever they might have wished for, but it was theirs a handful of years stolen back from fate, each day a defiance. When the first silver threaded Beren's hair, Lúthien did not weep. When her own steps lost their dancer's lightness, Beren simply walked slower beside her. They had faced down gods and monsters. Time's gentle erosion held no terror. And when the end came, as it must, it found them curled together beneath their favorite willow, fingers intertwined, their breaths slowing like twin flames, guttering in unison. The legend says they passed as shadows into the west, two hearts beating as one until the very last. But in Osiriand, the willow still stands, its leaves trembling with the memory of a song. And if you listen closely, when the wind is right, you might hear it, not an elegy, but a lullaby, sweet and unbroken, as if love itself had learned to whisper through the trees. The first warnings came as screams in the night guards torn apart at Doriath's borders, their armor crumpled like parchment under jaws that dripped with molten fire. Karcharoth, the Red Maw, was no longer a beast, but a tempest of teeth and fury, the Silmaril's holy light burning him from within, twisting his flesh into something monstrous. Everywhere he rampaged, the earth itself seemed to blister, trees withering at the mere shadow of his passage. In the halls of Menegroth, the air grew thick with dread. King Thingol's face was ashen, as scouts stammered their reports. Villages reduced to smoldering ruins, the river choked with blood. Beren stood at the edge of the council, his missing hand a constant ache, his body still carrying the scars of Angband. Yet when Thingol's gaze found him, heavy with unspoken accusation, he did not flinch. "I unleashed this horror," he said quietly, his voice roughened by guilt. "I will face it." Luthien's fingers dug into his arm, her eyes wide with protest, but the truth hung between them like a blade. This was not just duty, it was the only way to mend the fracture his quest had left in the world. The hunt began at dawn. Beren rode with Thingol's mightiest warriors, their silver spears glinting in the pale light, but it was the mortal who led them, not by strength, but by the terrible kinship of pain. He alone understood the madness driving Karcharoth, the way the Silmaril's fire gnawed at the wolf's soul, just as it had seared his own flesh. When they cornered the beast in a narrow gorge, its howl shook the cliffs, sending rocks tumbling like hail. The battle was chaos. Elven arrows shattered against Karcharoth's hide, swords snapped like twigs in his jaws. Beren, armed only with a hunting knife and the reckless courage of a man who had already bargained with death, lunged for the beast's throat. What happened next was a blur of crimson and fire. Karcharoth's claws raked Beren's chest, splitting skin and sinew, but the mortal's blade found its mark, a desperate thrust upward, through fur and muscle, into the heart where the Silmaril's light still festered. The wolf's death throes were apocalyptic, his body convulsing as the jewel's radiance erupted from his maw, blinding all who watched. When the light faded, Karcharoth lay still, his monstrous form crumbling to ash around the Silmaril, now dulled by gore but whole once more. Beren staggered back, his breath coming in wet, ragged gasps. The ground beneath him was slick with his own blood, the edges of his vision darkening. He barely registered the hands that caught him as he fell, only the familiar scent of Luthien's hair as she cradled him, her tears hot against his cooling skin. "You fool," she whispered, but her voice was all love, no anger. "You glorious, stubborn fool." His fingers, trembling, brushed the Silmaril where it lay beside them, its light flickering weakly through the filth. "At least, it's done," he managed. Lúthien pressed her forehead to his, her voice barely audible over the rushing of the river nearby. "Not for long," she promised, and in her words was a vow that would shake the very halls of Mandos. The elves around them bowed their heads, bearing witness to something beyond grief. a love so fierce it would not even bow to the grave. And as Beren's breath slowed, as his grip on her slackened, the wind carried the first notes of a nightingale's song, sweet and insistent, as if the world itself was whispering, "This is not the end." The moment Beren's breath stilled, the forest seemed to hold its breath with him. Luthien's hands, still warm from clutching his, now trembled against the sudden coldness of his skin. Her grief was not the wild, keening sorrow of elves, but something quieter, deeper, a fissure splitting open in the bedrock of her soul. She did not wail. She did not curse the valor or the cruelty of mortal fate. Instead, she bent low, pressing her lips to his forehead, and whispered a single word, his name, as if it could anchor him to her just a heartbeat longer. Then she rose, her movements slow as winter sap, and turned to the gathered elves with eyes that held no more tears. "I go to him," she said, her voice soft but unshaken. The words were not a plea, nor a lament. They were a declaration, as inevitable as the tide. The elves parted before her, their faces etched with awe and sorrow, for they knew what no mortal could. Lúthien was choosing a path no elf had ever walked. She was stepping beyond the circles of the world, surrendering the undying light in her veins for the fleeting warmth of a love that had already burned its last. As she lay beside Beren's body, her fingers entwined with his, the air around them shimmered not with magic, but with the weight of a choice that shook the very foundations of Arda. Her breath slowed, her heartbeat dimming like a star at dawn, until at last it stilled. The elves murmured prayers, but no dirge was sung, for this was not an ending. It was a crossing, and then silence, not the emptiness of death, but the hush of a world waiting. Even the valor, who had watched unmoved as kingdoms rose and fell, found themselves stirred by the quiet audacity of this love. Mandos, stern and implacable, lifted his hand. The halls of the dead had never before released a soul, but Lúthien's song had unraveled something in the timeless order of things. A new thread was woven into the tapestry of fate. Two spirits, bound not by the laws of elves or men, but by something older, purer, a love that refused to be measured in lifetimes. Where others saw an ending, the valor glimpsed a beginning, and so they granted what no one had dared ask, a realm beyond the edges of the world, where twilight never faded and dawn never broke. A place where Beren and Lúthien could walk, not as memories, not as shadows, but as themselves whole, untouchable, endless. Their laughter would echo in the glades where no mortal foot could tread, their voices blending with the wind that carried no sorrow. And though their bodies lay beneath the willow in Osiriand, their love became something more than legend. It became a whisper in the grass, a glimmer in the starlight, a reminder that even in a world of darkness, some flames are too bright to be quenched. Not by time, not by death, not even by the will of the gods. In Doriath's moonlit halls, where the air hums with the echoes of ancient spells, the tale of Beren and Lúthien is woven into the very tapestries that adorn the walls. The bards sing it not as a dirge, but as a hymn, a melody spun from defiance and devotion, each note a reminder that even the mightiest darkness can be pierced by love. The Silmaril, resting now in Queen Melion's keeping, glows with a light that seems almost gentle, as if tempered by the hands that once bore it through hellfire. But don't mistake its radiance for peace. That jewel carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken reckonings, its brilliance a beacon for both hope and ruin. Elven kings and mortal poets alike whisper of its power, yet none dare forget the price paid to wrest it from Morgoth's grasp. For every time the Silmaril catches the starlight, casting prismatic shards across the marble floors, the shadows at the edges of the room seem to stir whispers of Fëanor's oath, the restless hunger of those who still crave its light. Even in triumph, the jewel is a lodestone for strife, its very existence a challenge to the fragile truces of Middle-earth. And yet, when Thingol lifts it high, his face illuminated by its glow, the court falls silent not for the gem's splendor, but for the memory of the hands that brought it home. What makes their story endure isn't the glitter of the Silmaril or the grandeur of their deeds. It's the quiet, unshakable truth at its heart, that love, real love, isn't measured in years or leagues or battles won, but in the choices we make when all seems lost. Beren, broken and bleeding, still reaching for Luthien's hand. Lúthien, her voice raw from singing down a god, choosing mortality without hesitation. These are the moments that echo through the ages, long after swords rust and crowns crumble. And so, when the children of Doriath gather at twilight to hear the tale retold, they don't lean in for lessons about jewels or glory. They lean in for the part where the mortal and the elf princess, against all logic, against all fate, refuse to let go. That's the legacy that outshines even the Silmaril, not the light they stole, but the light they carried within. A reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to love so fiercely it sets the stars themselves aflame. Generations flowed like rivers under the stars, and the world bent beneath the weight of its own sorrows. Yet the legacy of Beren and Lúthien burned undimmed. It flickered in the veins of their grandson, Eärendil, a mariner with eyes that held both the sea's restlessness and the Silmaril's fire. The jewel, once wrested from Morgoth's crown, now rested against his chest as he stood at the prow of his ship, Vingalot, its sails silvered by starlight. Behind him lay Middle-earth, cloaked in war and weeping. Ahead, the shadows of the sundering seas, where no mortal or elf had ventured since the world was young. But Eärendil was neither wholly mortal nor wholly elf. He was a living bridge between worlds, and his cargo was more than a jewel. It was a plea. The voyage was a torment of waves and whispers. The sea itself seemed to resist him, as if the waters knew the weight of his errand. Storms clawed at the hull, and creatures of the deep, twisted by Morgoth's malice, rose to drag him into the abyss. Yet the Silmaril blazed brighter with every league, its light cutting through the gloom like a defiant shout. When the shores of Valinor at last glimmered on the horizon, a land forbidden to the children of Iluvatar Eärendil did not hesitate. He stepped onto the white sands with the jewel held high, its radiance painting the faces of the Valor themselves as they gathered in silent judgment. His voice, when he spoke, carried the echoes of all who had suffered. The elves hunted like deer, the men ground beneath the heel of darkness, the very earth gasping under Morgoth's shadow. You who shaped the world, he cried, will you abandon it now? The plea hung in the air, trembling, until the silence itself seemed to fracture, and then, a sound like the first note of a forgotten song. The Valor stirred, not in pity, but in recognition, for woven into Eärendil's words, into the light of the Silmaril, was the unbroken thread of Beren and Lúthien's love. A love that had defied death, bent the will of Mandos, and now, centuries later, dared to rouse the powers from their thrones. What followed was not mercy, but reckoning. The valor rose in wrath and glory, their hosts arrayed like a tempest given form. The war of wrath would drown the earth in fire and blood, yes, but it would also scour clean the festering wound of Morgoth's reign. And at the heart of the cataclysm, steering the tides of fate, was the light of the Silmaril, born by the heir of those who had first stolen it from the dark. When the battle ended and Morgoth fell, chains heavier than the roots of mountains upon him, the valor lifted Eärendil and his ship into the heavens. Not as exile, but as herald, the Silmaril became a star, a beacon for the lost and the hopeless, its gleam a reminder that no shadow, no matter how vast, is eternal. And if you listen to the old songs, the ones sung in the twilight by those who remember, you'll hear the truth. The light of that star is not just Eärendil's. It's theirs. Beren's stubborn courage, Lúthien's unyielding love, fused into something that outshines even the myths of the gods. Their story did not end in a glade or a grave. It spiraled outward, shaping the fate of elves and men, of kingdoms yet unborn. For every time a wanderer lifts their eyes to the evening star and feels, just for a moment, the ache of something beyond words, that is the echo of two hearts who refuse to bow. Not to darkness, not to doom, not even to the passing of ages. The night breeze in Doriath still carries the scent of crushed mallows leaves, just as it did when Lúthien danced upon them centuries ago. If you stand very still beneath the ancient beeches, you might hear it, the faintest echo of a melody woven into the rustling branches, a refrain so tender it makes even the oldest elves pause mid-step. Their bards still sing of her, of course, but not as some distant legend. When the harps play the lay of Lúthien, the strings thrum with immediacy, as if Beren might stride into the firelight at any moment, his missing hand wrapped in Lúthien's silken scarf. The story lies not in parchment or stone, but in the way starlight catches on dewdrops at dawn, each one a tiny mirror reflecting their courage. High above, the star of Eärendil pulses like a heartbeat, its light traveling leagues to brush the faces of those who still remember. Elven children are taught to trace its path with their fingers, whispering how their great-grandmother once touched the very jewel that now glitters in the sky. But the true magic lies in the spaces between the words, in the way an old warrior's breath catches when he recounts the wolf hunt, or how the weaver's threads always seem to gather into twilight hues when crafting tapestries of the mortal who loved an elven princess beyond reason. Even the trees bear witness. The willows by the river lean conspiratorially toward one another, their leaves murmuring secrets in a language only the heart understands. Some say if you press your ear to their bark, you'll hear the ghost of a duet, his rough mortal laughter, harmonizing with her silver song. The world has weathered ages since their passing. Wars have risen and fallen like tides, yet this one truth remains unshaken. Love is not measured in the length of days, but in the depth of the marks left behind. And oh, what marks they made, not just in the grand strokes. The Silmaril wrested from darkness, the doomsman's halls defied, but in the quiet moments that slip between the verses of the epic. The way Beren learned to braid Lúthien's hair with his one good hand, his clumsy knots making her giggle. The mornings she'd press elven healing herbs to his scars, though nothing could erase the ache of his mortal wounds. These are the fragments that stitch themselves into the fabric of the land, ensuring that when the west wind sighs through the grasses of Osiriand, it doesn't sound like mourning. It sounds like a lullaby, so when the stars wheel overhead tonight, pay attention. That flicker in the constellation of Menelmakar's sword, that's no ordinary twinkle. It's the echo of a promise, a spark struck between a mortal heart and an immortal soul, still burning bright enough to guide the lost home. At the edge of the world, where the sea meets the sky in an unbroken line of shimmering twilight, Beren and Lúthien stand together, not as fugitives, not as warriors, but simply as two souls who refuse to let go. The Silmaril's radiance, once so fierce it could blind the eyes of gods, now flickers softly in Lúthien's palm, its light dimming like a candle, guttering in a gentle wind. But the fading glow doesn't matter, not here, not now. For the first time in all their years of struggle, there are no crowns to reclaim, no oaths to fulfill, no shadows left to flee. There is only this, the press of Beren's forehead against hers, the way his breath mingles with hers in the cool air, the steady pulse of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips, a rhythm she'd follow into the void and back. The wind carries the scent of salt and distant blossoms, a whisper of worlds beyond this one. Somewhere behind them, the echoes of Middle-earth's wars and sorrows still churn. But here, at the threshold of the unknown, time itself seems to hesitate. Beren's voice, roughened by decades of laughter and pain, breaks the silence. "Do you remember," he murmurs, "the first time you called me mortal? Lúthien's smile is a fleeting thing, bright as the last star before dawn." "I was wrong," she admits, her fingers threading through his. "You were never just a man. You were the storm that uprooted my eternity. And then, the choice. Not a grand gesture, not a feat of magic or might, but a quiet, unshakable certainty. They step forward, not into darkness, but into a light that has no name. The Silmaril slips from Lúthien's grasp, tumbling into the grass like a fallen star, but neither of them glances back. Let the jewel return to the earth. Let its legend fade. What they carry with them needs no witness, no song, no throne to make it real. The moment their feet leave the ground, the air around them shivers, not with the cold of death, but with the warmth of a hearth long awaited. The threads of their fates, once tangled in the loom of the world, now unravel into something new, a tapestry woven not by gods or doom, but by their own hands. Behind them, the waves fold over their footprints, erasing all trace of their passing. But ahead lies a glade where the sun never sets and the shadows never lengthen, where the music of their joined laughter lingers in the leaves. This is not an ending, it's a homecoming, and though no bard will ever sing of it, though no chronicle will etch their names into its history, the wind remembers. The stars remember, and somewhere, in the quiet between heartbeats, the world is brighter for having borne them. The tale of Beren and Lúthien doesn't end with whispered echoes or fading footprints. It lingers in the way the wind carries the scent of blooming Nifredil through Doriath's ruins, in the hush that falls over firelit halls when a bard plucks the first notes of their song. Their story isn't carved into stone or etched in runes. It lives in the spaces between heartbeats, in the quiet defiance of choosing love when the world demands surrender. Think of the last time you stood beneath a sky so vast it made your chest ache. That's where their legacy lives, not in grand monuments, but in the unshakable certainty that some bonds are stronger than fate. They weren't the first to love, nor the last to suffer, but they were the ones who stared into the abyss and laughed. When Morgoth's shadow stretched across Middle-earth, when even the valor turned their faces away, two souls, one mortal, one eternal, clutched each other's hands and stepped into the fire. And here's the marvel, they didn't just survive it, they transformed it. Every scar, every loss, became a thread in a tapestry brighter than the Silmaril itself. What makes their triumph so enduring isn't the scale of their deeds, but the intimacy of their defiance. Beren didn't challenge Angband because he sought glory. He did it because Lúthien's smile was worth more to him than eternity. Lúthien didn't sing Mandos to his knees because she craved power. She did it because the thought of a world without Beren's voice was unthinkable. Their love wasn't a shield against the dark. It was a torch thrown into it, illuminating a path for every heart that came after. Look to the star of Eärendil, yes, but look also to the shepherd boy who hums their lay while tending his flock, to the weary traveler who finds strength in their story. Their light wasn't extinguished, it was scattered, carried forward in the courage of those who dare to love against the odds. The shadows may gather, kingdoms may rise and fall, but the promise of Beren and Lúthien remains. Love is not a fragile thing. It's the hand you reach for in the dark, the voice that whispers keep going when all seems lost. And so the tale spins onward, not as an ending, but as a beacon. Not they lived happily ever after, but they lived fully, fiercely, unafraid. In a world of fading myths, their story refuses to dim, because love like theirs isn't a closing chapter. It's the spark that lights the next.